Welcome to the Maverick Podcast, the show where we break down the biggest financial and geopolitical trends with hard-hitting numbers, sharp analysis, and just the right amount of wit. And today, we're diving into the future of global trade. Spoiler alert, it's complicated and volatile, and of course, packed with power plays. The latest research from Deutsche Bank, authored by Malika Sachdeva, thematic strategist, paints a striking picture of global trade at a crossroads. Their report, The History and Future of Trade, lays out in stark detail how the world economy is teetering between protectionism and globalization. So, let's get into it. The flatline trade era first, some cold, hard numbers. Global trade as a share of GDP has been stagnating since the 2008 financial crisis. We've seen this before, like during the Great Depression when the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariffs choked global commerce. And now, a déjà vu moment but with modern players. The report highlights that trade policy uncertainty has skyrocketed, from nearly zero in 1980 to a staggering 450 in 2025. That's right, folks, 450. Historically, globalization thrived in three waves: the late 19th century, think steamships and colonial expansion; the Bretton Woods-era post-1947, multinationals and containerization; and the 1990s to 2000s. But now, we're in a trade purgatory and nobody knows which way it'll tip. The US-China trade showdown. Let's talk about the elephant and the dragon in the room. The US and China dominate global trade, but their relationship is complicated. China's share of global manufacturing? A meteoric rise from 4.6% in 1995 to 31.8% in 2023, leapfrogging the US, 15%, Japan, 6.6%, and Germany, 4.6%. Meanwhile, the U.S. trade deficit tells a story of imbalance. China is still the biggest contributor, followed by the EU, Mexico, and Vietnam. But here's the twist. Despite the tariffs and trade wars, cheap Chinese goods have kept U.S. inflation in check for decades. That might be changing. National security and competitiveness. The U.S. isn't just worried about cheap imports, it's about strategic dominance. While China is leading in solar panels and electric vehicles, America is still playing catch-up. And Europe? Germany is losing market share in China to domestic competitors, with European competitiveness at a historic low. The EU is now scrambling with fiscal responses that blur the line between economic policy and national security, the Chinese perspective and the new trade map. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The US and China are still major trading partners, but the landscape is shifting. China's trade surplus isn't growing because of the U.S., it's the global South fueling the boom. Over 50% of China's surplus now comes from developing economies. At the same time, foreign direct investment into China has nosedived, from $350 billion in 2010 to just $50 billion in 2023. And there's a new middleman in town, ASEAN and Mexico. These economies are benefiting from the U.S.-China trade war, acting as alternative suppliers and manufacturing hubs. The future of trade winners and losers. Who wins in a fragmented trade world? Southeast Asia and Central Europe are the most vulnerable to shocks, but they're also the most adaptive. Meanwhile, U.S. protectionism is creeping back to 1930s levels. New 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico are reshaping the economic landscape. And let's not forget America's energy dominance. With primary energy production surpassing 100 quadrillion BTUs in 2020, the U.S. is less dependent on global supply chains than ever. Europe, however, might be in for a rough ride. The report estimates that an American international sales tax could slash 1.4% off EU GDP in a worst-case scenario. The most vulnerable? Open trade-dependent economies like those in ASEAN. So, what's the verdict? Trade, as we know it, is in flux. The ghosts of Smoot-Hawley are whispering, but new trade corridors are opening. Will protectionism win out? Or can globalization reinvent itself once again? One thing's for sure. Whatever happens next, it'll be a wild ride. This has been the Maverick Podcast. If you enjoyed today's deep dive, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with your fellow market mavericks. I'll see you next time for another fearless look at the forces shaping our world.